Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Athero Talk podcast, the podcast series hosted by the EAS Young Fellows. My name is Azin Kheirkhah from the Institute of Genetic Epidemiology in Innsbruck, Austria, and I will co host today's episode with Alexandr.
And hello, everyone. My name is Alexandr Ceasovschih from the Department of Internal Medicine at Grigore Popov University of Medicine and Pharmacy, Iași, Romania. It's great to be co-hosting today's episode.
We are thrilled to welcome a very special guest, someone whose work you will certainly recognize if you use the UK Biobank in your research. Joining us today is Professor Sir Rory Collins.
Sir Collins is a renowned epidemiologist with a background in medicine and statistics. He served as the head of clinical trial service unit and the epidemiological studies unit at Oxford University until 2025. His work focuses on large-scale trials, epidemiological studies, and meta-analysis. Since 2006, he has been the principal investigator and chief executive of the UK Biobank, a globally accessible biomedical database with samples and longitudinal data from 500,000 participants. He was knighted in 2011 for his service to science.
Hello, Professor Collins. It's a pleasure to have you with us today on behalf of the EAS Young Fellows. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me to take part.
Thanks. To start, we would love to get to know you a bit more personally. Could you please introduce yourself to our listeners? Who is Rory Collins?
Born in Hong Kong. My father ended up there at the end of the Second World War. He was an electrical engineer, trained during the war. And my mother was a very smart woman. She said, whatever happens, Britain is going to be a difficult place. So if you get offered a job, don't ask, just take it. She joined him 2 years later with my older sister. And then I was born in Hong Kong, had my initial education there, and then was sent back to Britain for further education before going to university at London University, St Thomas's Hospital Medical School. I was never really sure about doing medicine. I particularly enjoyed mathematics, but when I went to the careers advisor at school and said, well, I was thinking about doing mathematics, and he said, well, really the only kind of career you could have would be as an actuary, which is somebody who determines, your insurance premiums essentially. Didn't sound that interesting. So a friend was going to medical school, and I thought, well, maybe I'll do that. That sounds a little bit more interesting than determining insurance premiums. And that was really how I ended up at medical school. But after 2 years at St Thomas's, which was quite a small medical school, and of course, it wasn't a university experience. You were with a lot of people doing medicine, or actually not a lot of people doing medicine in a small college. You didn't really interact with people who were doing other subjects. And I still enjoyed the concept of mathematics. So there was an opportunity after your first 2 years to do a so-called intercalated bachelor's degree, an extra year. And you could do it in physiology, anatomy, biochemistry, philosophy, history of medicine. So I thought, well, I'll do it in statistics. And I found that wasn't possible. In fact, my medical school said, what statistics got to do with medicine? Are you serious about wanting to be in medicine? They were quite keen on perhaps me leaving. But anyway, I had this idea that the United States was more flexible. And so I went to the library, looked up a whole lot of universities, and wrote to 24 of them. Many of them didn't reply. Some of them said no. But one of them, George Washington University in Washington, D.C., said, why not? And so I went there for a year, did statistics for the whole year, and got a degree in statistics, and then transferred back to London to finish off my medical training. And that was really, what has resulted in my career. That kind of decision to try to do what I wanted to do, within a setting where that at the time wasn't thought to be appropriate.
That's really interesting. And it also shows how it's not always super linear, but if you want to pursue something, you just go for it and you find a way to do it. Um, do you have any hobbies or activities that you particularly enjoy in your free time?
Yeah, I like playing tennis. Not well. Well, I like playing well, but I don't play well. But I find it's the time where I completely switch off in terms of whatever's happening um, in work, or indeed outside of work. If I'm trying to play tennis, then I find that it's a timeout. So where I can, I try to see if I can get a few games.
It's really interesting. Professor, you were knighted in 2011 and also named among Time's 100 most influential people in health in 2024. What would it like to receive these honors? And did the visibility help raise the awareness of your work? And we have to ask, did you actually get a sword during the ceremony?
Yeah, there was a sword involved. Uh, I mean, there's a lot to unpack in that question, but obviously, it's very nice when people recognize what you do. Um, but my feeling is it's much more important that you recognize yourself, what you've done, what actually has been a consequence of the opportunities you've had, the people you work with, and the purpose of doing things is not to be recognized. The purpose of doing things is to make a difference, and really trying to keep that at the front of one's mind, that uh, better to do something useful that really makes a difference and not be recognized for it than be recognized for things that don't. Um, uh, and so that, as I say, it's nice when it happens, but it's not the purpose. As to the sword, yeah, when you go up to be knighted, and what was particularly special um, was that my mother was still alive and she was there. And because she was quite frail, they were very nice to her, and they helped her up there and popped her in the front row along with my sister and my wife and stepdaughter. Um, so that was great, because she'd been wondering what the hell I'd been doing with my life in terms of useful occupation. So it was nice for a little bit of endorsement in that respect. But yes, you go up, and it was actually Prince Charles, now King Charles, who knighted me rather than the Queen. And someone whispers in his ear why you're there. And he started to talk about, I gather you work on heart disease, and you've done this work on statins, and um, aren't those the drugs that cause side effects? And so I was explaining, no, actually they're very effective and they don't cause side effects. And then I thought, do I really want to have a discussion and debate with somebody who's holding a sword? And thought maybe this was the time to you agree to disagree quietly, and have the sword tapped on my shoulders.
That is really a fascinating story. I loved it actually.
As a follow-up, could you describe a typical day in your life? How do you balance research with multiple leadership roles, Professor?
Well, for the last, I mean, I see my career has been one of two halves. The first half was really, the first 20 years was learning how to do randomized controlled trials, particularly looking initially at how you improve the treatment of heart attack, working on drugs like streptokinase and aspirin in the emergency setting of acute myocardial infarction. And then moving on to thinking about how you could prevent it in the first place, and a lot of focus on cholesterol lowering with statins and with other interventions, and still working on that, but largely in collaboration now with colleagues in Oxford. And then the second half was trying to deliver a UK Biobank study. I mean, obviously, as you get more involved in a research career, you're working more and more with people. You're perhaps less involved in the day-to-day. And so it was in that latter period where I got more involved in, if you like, administrative aspects. You're trying to create a department in Oxford, population health science, that would prosper in the future. You're thinking about how you can help the university to improve the opportunities for research as well as for teaching. So one gets engaged in more and more of those things. Last year, though, I stepped down as head of department, and I'm focusing now full-time on UK Biobank. And I have to say, that's really enjoyable. It's good to have other people do the more administrative aspects of things and to be able to think about the next phase of UK Biobank, because I may well not get the next 20 years, but if I were to, then that opportunity to think about how you take UK Biobank into the next phase to really deliver on the altruism of the 500,000 participants, to turn that into improvements in the prevention and treatment of health. So doing less or doing fewer different things and being able to focus and think about how we really make the most of UK Biobank is an enjoyable change.
Professor, do you have any advice for those who are starting to manage multiple responsibilities at the same time?
Yeah, learn how to say no. One gets lots of opportunities. One gets asked to do lots of things, and there's always a temptation to say yes, to try to be helpful. And clearly, one should help where one can, but you also need to think about what are your primary responsibilities in terms of what you're trying to do, what you're trying to change, how you're trying to make an impact. So ensuring that you focus on those things and don't allow yourself to be distracted by being helpful. What you're there for is to make a difference, and anything that really makes it less likely you can do that, maybe one of those things you want to consider saying no to.
So for this part of the episode, I'm gonna take over your question, Alex, because our next question already, Professor Collins replied to our question. So that's a great advice. I think a lot of young researchers will benefit from that. So you studied both medicines and statistics. Do you prefer one over the other? Has this combination influenced how you approach research? And would you recommend that young researchers gain a solid grounding in statistics?
I think pretty much everybody should have a reasonably solid grounding in statistics, whether you're a researcher or not. Understanding probability, understanding the likelihood of things happening or not happening is pretty important in terms of day-to-day life. But from the perspective of health and health research, I mean, clearly the direction of travel is away from the one that my medical school had in mind. And I think when I talked to my wife, Barbara Cazaday, who was the first female president of the European Society of Cardiology, who in many respects was similar to me. Her favorite subject was mathematics. She ended up going to medical school in Italy. I think if we were starting out now, whether we would go to medical school, I'm not sure. So when one considers health and health research now, what was very much a biological subject, I think is very much more a data science subject. I mean, that's what UK Biobank has become. It really is a shift towards people with hypotheses about how biology works, to a much more hypothesis-free approach where you allow the data to speak. And so it's the people who can enable data to speak rather than people who can tell the data what is going on. Um, and I think um, that really reinforces the value of understanding, I mean, not just statistics, but data science uh, for health research.
Now we want to focus a little bit more on the UK Biobank and probably what most of our listeners are really keen to listen to as well. So you're the principal investigator and chief executive of UK Biobank. Could you tell us more about the initial idea behind its founding and what were the biggest challenges?
It's always been a bit of a mystery to me as to why the founding funders, the UK Medical Research Council, which is the government funder, and the Wellcome Trust charity funder, decided to fund UK Biobank. I mean, there were a number of people, my colleague Richard Peto and I in Oxford, others in Cambridge and London, who uh, talked about the value of setting up a large prospective study with blood samples, mainly based on our observation that the studies that had been done in the past, looking at risk factors like blood cholesterol or blood pressure, had often been too small and hadn't got stored samples. But our attempts to get funding to set up such a study really were, well, they failed. And so it was a bit of a surprise when at the beginning of the century, the Medical Research Council and the Wellcome Trust decided that they were going to fund such a study. And when I've talked to people within those foundations, I mean, one of them said to me that within the Wellcome Trust, there were others saying this will get funded over my dead body. So there was a lot of opposition, and yet it got funded. And the UK research community really engaged with it. There were lots of groups around the country that considered what questions to ask to try to understand, say, diet or exercise or other aspects of risk factor exposures, what measurements to make, what samples to take, how to take samples in such a way that you would be able to measure things in the future in those samples, how to collect them in ways that would ensure that was possible. And then I was asked to deliver it in 2005, and largely because in the previous 20 years I had been with my colleagues working out how to run very large randomized controlled trials. So how to recruit people into trials and manage them in chronic disease trials, in particular trials like the heart protection study of 20,000 people in the UK that looked at lowering cholesterol in high-risk individuals. So it was really more about our ability to deliver, which was why I was asked to do that and to bring together the input that had come from scientists across the UK and deliver the UK Biobank study. So to recruit 500,000 men and women aged 40 to 69, so in middle age when they're generally reasonably healthy, and to set it up in such a way that we collected samples and information from them, and then followed them through the health record systems to find out what happened to them. And that's been really the last 20 years. And then as we've got additional funding, we've turned the samples into data, biochemistry data, hematology data, sequence data, now proteomics data has been generated. And we went back to the funders and said we'd like to image large numbers of them. So again, the scientific community came together and we worked out how to do large-scale imaging of the magnetic resonance of the brain, the heart, the body, DEXA, bone, joint, and body composition, carotid ultrasound. and then working with engineers to turn those data into understandable variables in the same way that you turn a blood sample into measurements, and then making those data available to the world's researchers. That was a key thing. I think that's the key aspect of UK Biobank that's made the difference. Not just that it's big, or that it's got very deep information, or that it's now been going on for a long time, but that it's actually accessible to researchers, to students, to early career researchers, to professors, to researchers in industry, to turn the altruism of the participants, their data, into discoveries that improve prevention and treatment of disease.
And building on that, could you share some behind the scenes aspect of the UK Biobank, some stories or challenges or decisions that the public might not usually hear about? Is there something you want to share with us?
Well, as I said, when I was asked to take it on, I was aware that a lot of careful work had been going on. But everybody's impatient. Everybody wants things to get going, and so there was a feeling in 2005 that it was going to fail. There was a lot of opposition to it, so it had been sold, as you like, as a genetic study. Genetics in the early part of the century was everybody was very excited about it and the opportunities. And I think it was funded on the concept it was a genetic study. And quite rightly, people who are expert in genetics said that this was a bad study if what you're interested in genetics. The great thing about your genes is they don't change. And so, particularly when genetics was quite expensive, the most effective way of looking at the association of genes with disease was to take people with disease and compare them with those who didn't, because the disease doesn't change your genes. But if you're interested in environment, lifestyle, proteins, metabolites, all the things that can be changed by disease, then you need a prospective design. You need to get those measurements before disease has occurred so that they're not being influenced by disease. The best way to get people to stop smoking is to get them to have a heart attack. They stop smoking. But the heart attack doesn't cause people to stop smoking, or it's the smoking that causes the heart attack. And so I had to actually explain to the genetics community that this is not a genetic study. And the moment I did that, they said, "Oh, okay, well, then it's a very good idea." But there was a lot of opposition, and no one was actually saying to that opposition, "Well, that's not why it's being done this way." And I went to talk to quite prominent genetics researchers, to politicians who were being advised that this was a waste of money, and just trying to explain that this was, if you like, old-style epidemiology, but with the potential to look to see how genes would interact with your lifestyle and environment. And once that was done, then that opposition largely dissipated.
There is currently a boom in biobanking. What are the major advantages in the UK Biobank compared to the other initiatives?
When we were asked to set up UK Biobank by the Wellcome Trust and the Medical Research Council, they said, this is a major investment. And as such, it is not a study just for you to use. This had to be a study where the participants understood and continued to understand that the data would be made available as widely as possible to as many researchers to do the widest range of health-related research. And our emphasis is always on, yes, it's a big study. Yes, we can make it deeper with more information about the participants. And of course, as it continues, there will be more and more people who develop disease, which will make it statistically more powerful for understanding the determinants of disease. But if researchers can't actually get access to the data, if we can't enable them to do all the different kinds of analyses that they want to do on those data, then we fail. So what success means is to enable, to empower researchers, to honor the altruism of the participants who've made those data available by removing as many obstacles as we can to allowing researchers to turn the data into knowledge that improves health. And so it's access, it's accessibility that is the key success of UK Biobank. And if you like, crowdsourcing the best scientists wherever they are to turn the data into knowledge.
Professor, have you personally ever participated in the scientific study or biobank? And what are the main benefits for participants? And how can we encourage long-term engagement in such studies?
Yeah, I'm a UK Biobank participant. What do I get out of it? The feeling of contributing, allowing the data to be used. There's no feedback to participants. We make it very clear that they are donors in the same way that, somebody who provides blood doesn't get told who it's given to. They know that it's going to be made available to help save a life. The same with UK Biobank. This is a donation. One is giving information that collectively will make a difference. The key thing from the point of view of the UK Biobank team is that we have to continue to deserve that trust of the participants, that we explain to them how the data are being used. We explain to them how it's making a difference. We try to encourage them to contribute more information and explain why, in order that the data can do even more. So I mentioned imaging. We invited people to come back for imaging. We have four imaging sites across the UK. And the imaging visit takes 5 hours because we do a repeat of the baseline assessment, which is about a 2-hour assessment of questions and measurements and biological samples. But then they go through MR of brain and heart and body and DEXA, etc. So the whole visit is about 5 hours. People have to travel up to 100 miles to get to these centers. And a quarter of the participants are willing to do that. We've imaged over 105,000 participants in those 5-hour visits. And you would have thought that having come back and done that, if you asked them to do it again, they would say, you're joking. 60% of them are willing to come back, and we're now doing a repeat imaging assessment. So we had the baseline assessment of 500,000 people. About 10 years later, some 105,000 have come back. And we're now about a third of the way through of 4 years after that on average, 60,000 of them will come back for repeat imaging. And then those imaging data are being turned into derived variables, so they can be of use to researchers who are not imaging experts. And they can be used in the same way that, say, a hematology measure or biochemistry measure would be used. The researchers can use all these data to understand disease. So I think explaining to participants how they're making a difference has been the way in which we've engaged them. But they clearly are a pretty special group.
It's really interesting to hear that also the willingness of all the participants and all the whole effort really actually makes UK Biobank successful. So UK Biobank has been running for around 20 years with researchers from over 90 countries and more than 15,000 publications. We have 3 questions. So first, which years were particularly productive? Second, which countries contribute the most? And third, what types of data are most in demand?
So the numbers of publications each year increases. I mean, last year alone, there were over 5,000 peer-reviewed publications from UK Biobank, from thousands of researchers across the world. Initially, it was used by researchers in the UK because they had been involved in designing it, they knew about it, and they accessed it. When in around 2016, we were provided with funding from the government to genotype all 500,000 participants. And that, that was at a time when people were pulling together studies of a few thousand people in meta-analyses to try to understand what the genetic determinants were of height or heart disease or whatever. We were able to announce to researchers that they could get access to 500,000 people's genotypes in one study. It was a transformation. And I remember we had a meeting at the American Society of Human Genetics to say these data were available. And we saw a big increase, particularly in the US, but also in across Europe. And then in 2019, we went with the head of the Medical Research Council and head of population studies from the Wellcome Trust to China. And we had a joint meeting there with a study that we had set up in parallel from our department in Oxford, called the China UK Biobank of 500,000 people. And we encourage researchers in China to use UK Biobank. And we've seen a big increase in the use of the resource in China. And that is helping to encourage access to studies in China. So I would say at the moment it's the UK, US, China. We see a number of countries in mainland Europe are using it a lot. Japan, Australasia. But I tend to focus on the parts of the world that are not using it and thinking about why are they not using it and what can we do to help with that. So we now have a way in which to make access to the data free for researchers from less well-resourced parts of the world. We can also provide them with free compute on our cloud-based research analysis platform. And we're looking at how we can make all of our information available in multiple languages to see whether that can reduce friction, and trying to explore ways in which to increase use by researchers wherever they are, because the money may be distributed unevenly across the world, but intellectual capacity is spread evenly. And we want to take advantage of that. We want to turn the data into as much knowledge, as I said earlier. And that, for that, we want to have as many different scientists with as many different ambitions and imaginations using the data.
That's a great approach. And the data are used to study a wide range of conditions from cardiovascular disease, COVID-19, all the way to Alzheimer's disease. Have any findings genuinely surprised you? Are there overlooked areas or emerging topics in atherosclerosis that deserve more attention?
Well, I think that, the kind of poster boy or poster girl, if you like, of UK Biobank has been the, if you like, discovery of the whole concept of polygenic risk scores, which was actually the work of a PhD student at the Broad. So just demonstrating the value of making the data accessible to people at whatever part of their career they are. So the kind of concept that genetic variants of small effect across the genome in combination could identify a few percent of individuals who are equivalent risk to single gene disorders. So, 3 or 4% of individuals who have a risk of cardiovascular disease equivalent to familial hypercholesterolemia, 10 times more common. I think that we're starting to see the polygenic risk score, which went against a lot of previous wisdom, get incorporated into clinical practice. So looking at how we use, say, statins based not on age and sex, but on risk, particularly when we're thinking about people at younger ages, or screening for disease like breast cancer or prostate cancer based on risk rather than on age. So I think that that's been a big change. Where I think that UK Biobank will make a difference is on understanding dementias. And we know that a lot of dementia is atherosclerotic in nature. Even people who have Alzheimer's, there's often an atherosclerotic dimension to this. And a lot of the problems with the knowledge that there is about dementia, I think, is confounded by relatively short follow-up. And so a lot of the views or beliefs as to what causes dementia are actually things that dementia has caused. So, the idea that inactivity causes dementia, I think, is actually the onset, the slow onset of dementia over a period of time leading to inactivity is reverse causality. So what UK Biobank has now is 20 years of follow-up. So we can make the data available in such a way that researchers can avoid that. They can look at risk factors studied in middle age and disease occurring in old age. And what we're trying to do is really deepen the characterization of the cases of dementia. We're going to bring back people with memory and movement problems, image them, collect biological samples, clinical assessment, so that it will be possible for researchers to look more specifically at a very wide range of exposures measured many years before, very deep characterization of people with memory or movement problems. And I'm hoping that that will really transform our understanding of the determinants of dementia and thereby the ways in which to prevent and treat it.
There has been public discussion about data sharing and safety, especially in relation to international access. What are the main challenges biobanks face today, and how have these evolved with developments like artificial intelligence, data security, or ethics?
I always try to kind of characterize this as the difference between sins of commission and sins of omission. So people are very concerned about the risks of doing things, and less concerned sometimes about the risks of not doing things, the harms that can be caused by not doing things. And it comes back to my point about making the data accessible. The safest data are the inaccessible data. The safest data are the data that you don't allow any researcher to use. And so it's always a balance, and the question is how to get the balance right. I think that what we have at UK Biobank is the demonstration of the value of making data accessible. Those 15,000 plus publications are a demonstration of knowledge created by making data accessible. And we're starting to see that translating into improvements in prevention and treatment. I think there are opportunities, though, to do it better. So initially, when we made UK Biobank data available, we would provide downloaded, de-identified data to researchers. So they could put it on their computers and they were required to keep it secure, so they could work on it. But of course, if you disseminate data, you are losing some control over it, and you're requiring the researchers to comply with the material transfer agreement that they have signed and to take that appropriately seriously. As the data in UK Biobank became bigger, particularly when we were able to sequence all 500,000 participants, it really became impossible to move the data like that. And so we established a cloud-based platform where instead of the data going to researchers come to the data. And that was driven by the scale of the data, but it does provide an opportunity also to increase the security and the control over the data. And I think that move, although it is somewhat less convenient for some researchers because they're used to working on their own computer system, that move is one that I think enables access to very large, complex, and sensitive data in a more secure way, um, and and I think is the future.
In addition to your work with the UK Biobank, are you also leading the Orion for trial? Could you briefly explain the aims of this study and why it's so important?
Well, I think Orion 4 is really interesting because it's testing a completely new approach to cardiovascular prevention. The idea of small interfering RNAs, so a small molecule that essentially goes into the liver and blocks the synthesis, in this case, of PCSK9, the protein PCSK9. Um, so by contrast with the antibodies that were developed that mop up PCSK9 once it's been produced and have to be given injections every couple of weeks, and of course antibodies are expensive to make, inclisiran is a small molecule, it goes into the liver, blocks the synthesis, so you don't need small volumes, and it has a very long effect. So you can give the injections every 6 months or even every year, and halve LDL cholesterol. So the idea of essentially vaccinating against heart disease, and the convenience of being able to get an injection or even give yourself a subcut injection every 6 months or a year, rather than taking a tablet um, every day, I think is potentially very attractive. So the Orion 4 is the first large clinical outcome study. It will read out at the beginning of 2027. And my hope is it demonstrates not only clinical efficacy in terms of lowering the risk of cardiovascular events, but it also is shown to be a safe intervention, because there are now new approaches. There's other approaches using small interfering RNAs that can be used to control blood pressure, LP levels. So we show that this approach is both safe and effective, then I think that will help to transform the way in which we prevent cardiovascular disease. And it fits with UK Biobank in a number of ways. I mean, PCSK9 is one of the interventions that's really identified through genetics in family studies and population studies. And I think its use could fit very well with the concept of polygenic risk scores. You know, if you're in your 30s and you're identified based on a polygenic risk score, or indeed any other information that's being very high risk, then maybe much more attractive to have an injection every year or so, rather than to take tablets every day. So I do see them as being kind of a coming together, if you like, of genetics, genetic discovery, genetic prevention, and cardiovascular prevention.
Professor, for young clinicians or scientists interested in cardiovascular trials, what skills or experiences were most critical in leading a study like Orion 4, and how can they position themselves to contribute to similarly impactful research?
My experience has been to find yourself in an environment where you're supported to learn. It takes a remarkably long time uh, to learn how to do research well, um, and you know, being involved in the nitty gritty of designing a trial, running a trial, doing a lot of things that may feel um, very prosaic, very basic. Um, but the more you learn about the kind of detail, I think the more you're able to then see the bigger picture as well, and to deliver the detail within the bigger picture. So when I was doing trials early on, you being part of actually recruiting patients into trials, giving the treatment to them, analyzing the ECGs, um, uh, understanding the inefficiencies, and then thinking about how to make things work more smoothly. Um, you need to know a language before you can speak eloquently in it, and I think the same is true in research.
What do you see as the future of biobanks? Should every country develop its own to capture regional differences? Are there still underrepresented populations?
My view is that a biobank like UK Biobank, a prospective study, is an enormous undertaking. It's expensive, it's long. And so you want to have a really good reason for setting up another. Um, it's not about having your own. It's about having biobanks or prospective cohorts in interestingly different populations or settings. So where the risk exposures may be very different, um, or where the disease rates may be very different. So I don't think it's about being representative of different parts of the world so much as being representative of humanness, representative of the different kinds of exposures that we see across the world, and representative of different rates of disease. I mean, as Richard Doll and Rich Peter have often said, when you look across the world, there are parts of the world where a particular disease is very common, and other parts where it's very rare. That really argues for avoidability, and there being drivers of those differences. So you want to have that full range of exposures in order to understand how to avoid disease, and you need to be able to look at places where they have high and low rates to try to understand what the differences are.
So, as we come to the end of our interview, we have a special section we call the Graveyard of Ideas. We often hear about success stories, but rarely about failures, yet they are a very essential part of research. We invite all our guests to share an idea, project, or grant that didn't work out as planned. What would you like to contribute to our Graveyard of Ideas?
We had an enormous success with the ISIS-2 study. This was a randomized controlled trial that looked at using streptokinase in the emergency treatment of heart attack and the addition of low-dose aspirin. Um, and in 17,000 patients, that demonstrated that clot-dissolving therapy with streptokinase reduced mortality by about a quarter, and aspirin reduced it by another 20-25%. It was a fantastic success. And it came about through work that I did, particularly with Salim Yusuf at McMaster, where we trawled through all the previous randomized controlled trials of different treatments for heart attack. And the one that stood out was that there had been a couple of dozen trials of streptokinase. Individually, they weren't really compelling, but collectively, they suggested that streptokinase might reduce mortality by a quarter. We did ISIS-2, it worked. And that really kind of was the first time that we had any treatments that made a difference. So we thought, well, this is fantastic. Well, let's have a look at the next one. And when we looked at the different randomized trials, one that really stood out was randomized trials of intravenous magnesium. And there had been half a dozen small trials that suggested a reduction in mortality of 50%. And then another study came along from Britain that suggested somewhat lower, but still it looked like another reduction of a quarter. So we thought, wow, this is going to be the next big benefit we're going to demonstrate. So we worked really hard to get funding to do a study that included intravenous magnesium. It also looked at ACE inhibitors and nitrates. The ISIS-4 trial, we were all convinced that magnesium would be positive. Did the trial completely flat, no effect at all. I mean, during the trial, there were researchers writing to our data monitoring committee saying that the trial was unethical because it was so clear from the meta-analysis that magnesium was effective. At the end of the trial, there were people who were still convinced it was effective. And in fact, the National Institutes for Health said, oh, it's because you did the trial in the wrong people at the wrong time with the wrong, we're going to do it the right way. And so they funded another trial called, ironically, the MAGIC trial. And that trial also confirmed that magnesium didn't work. So it was a huge amount of work to find out that magnesium didn't work. And I think if you go onto the internet, you can still find people who accused Richard Peto and myself for having been mass murderers for having got the wrong result with intravenous magnesium. Although I'm hoping that those accusations are less vehement than they were. But yeah, if you want a graveyard of ideas, magnesium is definitely mine.
Professor, thank you so much for sharing that. It's incredibly valuable to hear these perspectives.
This was truly an incredible interview. I'm sure the next time I'm using UK Biobank, I'll have a flashback of this interview and recall all our discussions. Thank you, Professor Collins, for your time and for sharing your insights with us.
Thank you very much. And I hope you continue to use UK Biobank and you encourage others to do so. Thank you.
And thank you to all our listeners for joining us today.
This podcast is for you, and we truly value your feedback. So don't forget to share this episode with your colleagues and stay tuned for future episodes. And once again, thank you very much, Professor Collins.